Hi there. So, for this particular case study, we're going to be looking at an incident involving Rocket Junior High. So, first, let's look at the facts. This particular case study is worth examining because it presents an ethical dilemma that involves school practices and being cognizant of societal impacts on groups of students. Here are the events that occurred in the case study. Richard called James to his office regarding James's third tardy of the week. James's teacher recalls James because he is seen giving something to David. Richard has David, James, and an officer in his office, again as a result of the teacher informing him about this. Richard questions both boys about the exchange. James says he gave David something to hold for him. David refuses to respond and starts to tear up. Officer searches David and finds brass knuckles, which are prohibited at the school. David is handcuffed by the officer. David cries, and James says that he was going to, quote, kick his ass if he didn't hold the knucks for me. The officer explains he has to take both students to jail and charge them with felony possession of a prohibited weapon. Both David and James are sent to a youth detention facility. Richard calls mothers of both students. James's mother agrees to let James stay in the facility. David's mother goes to Richard's office to ask why things were carried out this way. Richard gives no answer and gives her the address of the detention facility. David's mother was not aware of the prohibited weapon policy. Richard fills out paperwork for James, but did not for David. 1 week passes. David in his original classes, but James is placed in a disciplinary alternative education program. The director of secondary education contacts Richard to ask for David's expulsion paperwork. Richard says he will not comply and explains the situation. The director says he understands Richard's position, but explained that Richard should follow policy and file the expulsion paperwork, or Richard would receive a reprimand included in his personnel file. So now we can look at the legal and ethical issues in place. There are legal and ethical issues primarily with the unbalanced treatment of both students and their families. The prohibited weapon in question was a set of brass knuckles which could cause bodily harm to other students. Again, just baseline ethics of potentially harming someone else and trying to avoid that. James has claimed he intimidated David. David said nothing to refute or deny this. The officer arrested both students without getting testimony from David. Whether or not there was probable cause for the arrest is debatable and could result in specific legal issues. Again, this part isn't entirely clear, but could be argued in a court of law one way or another if David's family decided to take legal action. Richard made David's mother aware of the transfer of David to the detention center, but not adequately explain the full situation to her. A more ethical decision would be to inform her. Although both students were arrested by the officer for the same reason, Richard only files expulsion paperwork for James and not for David, which is an unethical decision. James had a history of discipline issues but was improving overall. David had no record of discipline and was an honor student. So here we can examine the full synthesis of what essentially happened. Richard, despite working hard to help bolster youth from the South Side like himself to respect school policies, has essentially unfairly targeted a South Side student to be the only one punished in an incident that also involved an honor student that could have led to an unsafe situation for the school. Again, somebody using the brass knuckles to harm someone. So here we can look at a total synthesis of the facts. These are the relevant facts of this particular case in terms of what is known and unknown. So if we examine the people, James has a history of fighting, though he had not been involved in one for months at the time of the incident, and tardiness. He is considered a leader among his peers and has encouraged them to improve grades and mingle with fellow students, possibly due to Richard's influence. He is muscular, has tattoos, and plays basketball recreationally. Richard has cultivated a personal relationship with James. Richard's relationship with David is minimal, but not largely known. David participates in honors classes and band. He has a slight build. Little else is known about him. There's really not too much more delving into David's background or his role within the school. With regard to sex, the incident involved 2 male students, was handled by 2 male staff, and the parents informed were both mothers of the students. It is unknown if any other family member was informed. Now, if we examine the place of this particular dilemma, Richard and James both have history with the south side of town, an area reputed to destroy young men. Again, this is probably largely based on opinion. David's community is unknown, and any other demographic information, whether we're talking about ethnicity, culture, economic status, whatever, about both students is unknown. Both James and David were originally students at Rocket Junior High, but James was transferred to the district's disciplinary alternative education program, and David wasn't. If we examine the program, David is involved in honors classes and band at Rocket Junior High. James was involved in classes at Rocket Junior High. Again, we don't know what type of classes, but just that they were the ones at the junior high school, but is now in the disciplinary alternative education program after this incident. So let's review our information. The impact that this situation had on stakeholders in the school and loose ends in the information provided should not be ignored. In general, the situation involves persecution of a student from the city's south side, which could damage the school's relationship with that community. The actions of the officer, if found to be done without probable cause, again, if legal action is taken, could cause distrust between the school staff / local police and students / parents. Again, students and parents might worry about a lot of unethical arrests potentially happening. James's transfer may cause a disconnect with his peers at Rocket Junior High, potentially causing regression in their progress with positive school culture. David's mother likely feels she was not well informed about this particular incident and school policies. Richard's decision to not file paperwork on David probably has caused distrust with the director of secondary education, since it makes Richard look unreliable to follow through with procedure on a serious matter, again, one that involves a weapon, a prohibited weapon. David's testimony of whether or not James coerced him into holding the weapon is still unknown. So now that we've examined the dilemma, we can identify our options. Even though considerable damage has already been done in this situation, it does not mean there aren't options worth considering from this point. So for number one option would be, in fact, not taking any further action and keeping things in their current state. In other words, Richard takes no further action. For option 2, an extreme option would be for Richard to file the paperwork requested and end up having both David and James in the disciplinary alternative education program. Number 3, another extreme option would be to appeal to have both David and James be cleared of charges so they could both continue to attend classes at Rocket Junior High, basically Richard admitting fault. Number 4, a less extreme approach would be to ask David to explain his reasons for taking the weapon now that some time has passed from the initial shock of the situation. If he admits to being intimidated, it may mean that a lesser punishment can be carried out instead of expelling him, again, if they appeal based on the concept of coercion being used. If his story is different, it could reveal that David in fact intended to harm someone and James was just covering for him, and it would be appropriate for both of them to be expelled. Again, it's something that we don't know for sure, and it's something we need to consider. And then finally, option 5, another option would be to look at the root of the dilemma, the zero tolerance policy regarding weapons. An appeal to the school board could result in lesser punishment for both David and James. And now we can evaluate those options. Evaluating the consequences of each option can help us make a decision on the ethical dilemma. For number 1, option 1 would just likely result in Richard being reprimanded or fired, again, if he took no action. David's expulsion would probably just be carried out by a higher power. For option 2, while option number 2 is a tough love option, it would result in a fair punishment for both students. Both students were found with a prohibited weapon at school, and they both are punished based on the policy set by the school board. Again, the no zero tolerance weapon policy. David and his family would probably be upset about this situation. Number 3, option 3 really creates the idea that the situation was largely a mismanagement by Richard. He would probably be reprimanded or fired. The school board's policy regarding weapons at school is undermined, which could create tension. For number 4, interviewing David, even at this stage, would be a responsible action to get a more informed story. The results of his testimony would probably still end in punishments for both parties, but leniency could potentially be provided if coercion was verified as part of the incident. And then finally, for number 5, altering the school board's policy about weapons could result in lesser punishments for both students if approved by the school board. However, this opens up the possibility of students feeling emboldened to bring weapons to school and/or families feeling that a regression in policy would create an unsafe environment for their children. So here is, in my opinion, the best option. The best overall option in this situation would probably be option 4, interviewing David to get his perspective. Even though an interview can't be conducted without David knowing James's answer to the nature of the incident, David would still potentially give an answer that provides more insight into the situation. If David's story matches James's, then an appeal can be made to a higher authority on the basis of coercion being involved. This would maybe reduce David's days in the disciplinary alternative education program if they still wanted to put him in that, or an alternative punishment like just in-school suspension or something equivalent to that. But if David admits to holding the weapon voluntarily, it essentially makes him an accessory. David could learn a valuable lesson that even if his personal intent in hiding the weapon is not to harm someone, that it still assists in someone else in causing harm, and therefore makes him culpable. Again, this ties into how real-world scenarios are taken into account as far as holding a weapon for somebody else. Finally, we would need to consider how to implement that particular option. To help make the chosen option as successful as possible, implementation of it should be considered with all parties in mind. Interview David, and then Richard fills out expulsion paperwork based on his response and requests an appeal if appropriate. Again, this would have to be an ethical decision based in part on Richard's own judgment, but he already has some conflicting feelings about this. If the appeal is made, you can inform David and his family to help ease their mind. Again, there would still probably be a punishment, but maybe a lesser one. If no appeal is made, you can still inform David and his family to allow them to prepare for his expulsion. Again, it may not be something that they were expecting, and they may need a little time to adjust. A legal representative from the school may be needed to help explain the decision based on the zero-tolerance policy on weapons. Again, since Mom wasn't very well informed on it, it may be helpful to have that legal representative there. Finally, James's family should not be informed of what degree of punishment David goes through to help comply with privacy policies. It's not really their business as far as the degree of punishment. Letting them know generally that the other student involved received a punishment without any specification may be appropriate to ensure that the school acted fairly. Again, to kind of let folks know that it wasn't just a Southside student who was just being targeted while the honor student got off scot-free. But again, you don't have to specify necessarily the type of punishment. Again, it is an ethical dilemma, so there is no straightforward answer to it, but I think based on the evidence we have, this is one of the best ways to potentially handle this situation.